Freedom for truth tellers.
Freedom for truth tellers.
That's why they're in jail, because they told the truth. They let us know the truth. Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. And Edward Snowden has to live in Russia because he told the truth. Freedom for whistleblowers, freedom for truth tellers.
Overthrow governments in Central America and other crimes against the people of the world.
My name is Nozomi Hayase. I'm a journalist who have been covering issues of free speech and the role of whistleblowers in democratic society. Today I'm here because I support freedom of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. For so long, we have been pushed out from democracy. Our elected officials and political parties, both Republicans and Democrats, have been undermining the will of ordinary people. Mainstream media, bought by corporate money, turned against the public interest, distorting information and manipulating public perception. For too long, American people have been kept in the dark. We've been made to live in an insulated reality of the American dream and engage in mindless consumption. We didn't know what our government is doing overseas under the pretext of fighting terrorism or humanitarian intervention. We didn't know these illegal wars in the Middle East and torture in Guantanamo. We didn't know what intelligence agencies are doing in the name of national security here at home and abroad. But now we know. Julian Assange, with his work with WikiLeaks, courageously came forward to fulfill the role of the free press. Through the method of transparency, WikiLeaks challenged the government's secrecy. The whistleblowing site gave American people information that those in power worked so hard to conceal. Through WikiLeaks' release of the Colorado Murder video and the publication of documents concerning the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we now know that the military rule of engagement is broken and that we become complicit in killing innocent civilians, including journalists. With their publication of files on prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, we know innocent men are detained by mistake, and the prisoners are exploited in interrogation. In 2013, revelation of Edward Snowden sent a shockwave to the world. WikiLeaks not only helped the NSA whistleblower attain asylum, but also alerted us the extent to which the NSA conducted mass surveillance at a global scale, even targeting political leaders of its ally countries for US geopolitical interests. WikiLeaks' publication of Vault 7, the largest publication of confidential documents that belong to CIA, revealed the agency's excessive power with its hacking tool to spy on people through smartphones and TVs. As a consequence of shining light on government war crimes and corruption, WikiLeaks has become a target of political retaliation. The Obama administration's persecution led Julian Assange to seek political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London in 2012. For the last 7 years, Assange has been unlawfully held by the UK government without charge, being denied access to medical treatment, fresh air, sunlight, and adequate space to exercise. Now the Trump administration carries on this Obama's war on truth tellers, trying to extradite this Western journalist to the US. What does this assault on free press reveal? It is a battle concerning who controls a narrative of history. For too long, we've been told to shut up. We've been made irrelevant in our own history. we become an object who is not participating in the unfolding story. Mainstream media, as a gatekeeper of power, censor information to protect the elite who seek to control narratives of history. We are shut out from democracy. We become object being tossed around and made to passively carry out script handed down to us. But this is no more. The days of the government oppression, their silencing and bullying of ordinary people are now over. WikiLeaks, through engaging scientific journalism, awakened creative forces inside history. By giving the public full archives of authentic documents, the organization provided means for us to directly connect with events and find our own place in history. This all started with a person with incredible conscience, former US Army Julian Manning, demonstrated extraordinary courage to defend the public right to know. Manning, through releasing vital information that belonged to the public, invited ordinary people like you and me to claim our own power and actively participating in changing the trajectory of history. For this brave act of conscience, Manning was sentenced to 35 years in prison. She served 7 years until President Barack Obama commuted her sentence in 2017. Now, she's back to jail for refusing to answer questions at the secret grand jury targeting WikiLeaks and Assange. She's been made to remain confined until she testifies or until the grand jury concludes its work. Throughout history, we've seen individuals who refuse to accept oppressive narratives imposed on them and instead acted for self-determination. At the beginning of the American Republic, 13 colonies fought to declare independence from King George, who imposed unfair taxation without representation. The proponent of the Bill of Rights opposed the ratification of the 1787 Constitution in order to restrict governmental power in order to safeguard individual liberties. From the women's suffrage movement to the civil rights movement, history has awakened. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, by refusing to give up her seat, defied unjust laws that perpetuate the story of racism in violation of ideals in the Declaration of Independence. Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X carried on this spark in history to liberate black people. In their act of civil disobedience, they all become a subject who determines their own history and destiny. In 1964, here in the Bay Area, we've seen the new momentum of this awakening of history. Mario Savio, a young student of the University of California at Berkeley, inspired by the courage of black people fighting for their freedom, exercised free speech that had consequences. Young people's rebellion against bureaucracy and the university's crackdown on students who were participating in the civil rights movement gave birth to the free speech movement. Now, over 50 years later, WikiLeaks began pushing boundaries of free speech, making it possible for a young whistleblower to carry out the American tradition of civil disobedience. Both Julian Assange and Julian Manning, with their courage, tenacity, and integrity, reminded us all of our own significance as authors of history. We are agents for change in the history that we all belong to. We write and define a course of its story with our heart's imagining. Our story is based on truth in the founding documents of this country that said, all men are created equal. Our narrative ensures life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all people. Ours is transparency for the powerful and privacy for the individual. Ours is a democracy where we, the people, are in charge of making decisions that affect every aspect of our society. Ours is a society governed by a rule of law that protects the rights of the vulnerable and guarantees that no person, whether it is president or a billionaire, can act above laws. Our story is one that honors the conscience of ordinary people and rewards journalists who protect their souls and publish information in the public interest. We condemn the US government's prosecution of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and the Justice Department's attempt to force the alleged source to testify against the journalist for publishing government's wrongdoing. These draconian actions of the state pose a great threat to our democracy, free speech, and fundamental human rights. Our effort to free Julian Manning and Julian Assange must become a movement. Our solidarity to defend the whistleblower and WikiLeaks is our non-violent civil disobedience against those in power who seek to control us behind the facade of democracy. This is our civil rights movement. This is the free speech movement of our time. We must use our right to free speech to speak out, associate with one another, to mobilize and end this secret grand jury and this prosecution of free speech, free press. Free Julian Manning. Free Julian Assange.
This effort here we have is part of an international campaign that's going on. Freedom for Julian Assange and also freedom for Chelsea Manning. And one of the issues is for the working class and the trade unions is that this attack on democratic rights, this attack on journalists is an attack on the rights of all working people. The intimidation, the threats to intimidate whistleblowers is going on throughout this country. In fact, right here in San Francisco, whistleblowers have been fired. Daryl Whitman, who used to work at this building, who is a federal lawyer, is a whistleblower. And he learned from Julian Assange, the release of WikiLeaks, that Karen Lerner and other people in the US government were conspiring to silence him and to prevent him from speaking out about serious health and safety concerns. There's a Boeing crisis today, the crash of these Boeing planes. What we discover is the FAA and these government agencies have been captured by the companies they're supposed to regulate. WikiLeaks has exposed this and exposed the collusion, the criminality of the system, a capitalist system which allows the cover-up and the destruction of lives, really. Right here at Hunters Point Shipyard and at Treasure Island, there's been a collusion between Nancy Pelosi in this building, between Dianne Feinstein, between Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom and London Breed, the top capitalist politicians in San Francisco
and the United
States have been colluding and conspiring in secret to continue to build condos built by Lennar at Hunters Point and Treasure Island. Professor George Wright, he's with the United Public.
Publishing information.
What I'd like to do is to try to put into context what has happened to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and others, particularly whistleblowers, who have tried to present the truth to the American public about the transgressions and projects that the U.S. government has been carrying out for decades. But what we want to stress very strongly is after 40 years of neoliberal politics and at least 30 years of U.S. aggressive militarism around the world, that we've reached a conjuncture, a point that is crystal clear. It's extremely transparent as to what the political establishment and the ruling class is attempting to do. The United States at this point is facing three major crises that will determine how it's going to be carried out, will determine the future not only of the United States, but also the rest of the world. The crisis is a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism no longer is designed to respond to demand and to invest in domestic infrastructure and create jobs for the working class. Classic example here is the absurd reality of the so-called Transbay Terminal, where some $2 billion was put into this to facilitate development for the rich, etc. And we find out that it's closed because of lack of inspection of that facility. Again, the major crisis is the crisis of capitalism. We see the capitalist class putting money into speculation rather than into redeveloping the economy. The second major crisis the U.S. is facing is the crisis of imperialism. Once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States felt that it had free rein on gaining absolute hegemony over the entire world. But in the last 15 to 20 years, what we've seen is the rise of China, the rise of Russia, and other countries that have prevented the United States from attempting to achieve this absolute global hegemony. The result of that has been permanent war since 1991, and certainly since 2001 with the results of 9/11. We've seen the acceleration of that aggression. The third crisis is the legitimacy of the political system. More and more people on the progressive and liberal left and the left, as well as people on the right, are disgusted with the centrist policies of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And in fact, the reasons for Trump winning the election in 2016 really deal with the fact that a large number of working class people, predominantly white, have no belief in the Democratic Party or the so-called modern Republicans. At this point, what we see is the Democratic Party and some Republicans attempting to regain that legitimacy, to regain the ability to carry out wars, permanent wars, and also to rechannel resources to the 1% rather than to the majority of the population. The project that the Democrats and some Republicans are carrying out are pretty obvious. One is more war, more monies for war. The latest budget by Trump adds, I think, some $54 billion to the military budget, which would be almost $800 billion, which is more than the next 14 countries in the world spend for military on an annual basis. We're seeing right now in front of us, in a very transparent way, the United States carrying out an illegal coup d'etat in Venezuela to try to overthrow that social democratic party led by Maduro at the moment. Iran seems to be the next target on their list as well. The second part of the agenda is more and more austerity. In spite of the so-called New Democrats calling for socialism, or what I consider a mild form of New Deal liberalism, Medicare for all, free education, the ruling class wants to go in the opposite direction, and they're going to continue to do that by moderating, isolating movements from the progressive left. The third agenda on the part of the Democrats is censorship, whether it's a censorship of the internet, where we see collaboration by Facebook and Apple and other social media outlets working with the U.S. government, working with the CIA to purge the ability to use the internet in a democratic way. Also under the Obama administration, and this continues under the Trump administration, the repression of whistleblowers, and thirdly, the attack on independent journalists who are trying to tell the truth. At the centerpiece of this is Julian Assange. So what we need to know is what is happening. We have to develop an analysis, and we have to be very, very careful that in our people's opposition to Trump, that they forget to realize that the Democratic Party and its leadership is also in this game as well, and they're responsible and in complicity with the direction that I just outlined. Thank you very much.
Chelsea Manning is not charged with a crime. Chelsea Manning has been charged by a secret grand jury with no legal counsel. So she can have legal counsel outside of the courtroom, but when she goes in the courtroom, she doesn't have any legal counsel at all. So they're basically asking her questions and implying they want to have her say that Julian Assange asked her for the atrocity Iraq war logs. And the government said they weren't keeping track of the missions, how many people they killed or how many people they wounded, how many people they captured. But they were. And Bradley Manning, who later became Chelsea Manning, found that out, and he felt and she felt that it was very important that this got out to the world. So she spent 7 years in military prison, 1 year in solitary confinement without any clothes. And Obama, because of the public support of Chelsea Manning, gave her a pardon. But the Trump government has reinstituted the pressure on her to end Julian Assange, because Julian Assange is a truth teller. And that's about it. There's a lot of other things on the Jimmy Dore show. If you go to YouTube, Jimmy Dore, Chelsea Manning, you can see a whole background of not only Chelsea Manning, but Daniel Ellsberg, who supports Chelsea Manning, and also supports Julian Assange. Chelsea Manning, she's locked up far away. My voice is better. Chelsea Manning, she's locked up far away. When do we want her home? We want her home today.
You already know this. Don't believe the mainstream media. They lie. They lie and lie and lie, so don't believe them. They're trying to say all this stuff about Chelsea Manning. It's not true. She saved us. She's saving us and taking a big risk to go to prison just to not expose what they're to expose what the U.S. is doing and not get Julian Assange in trouble, who's another free-speaking truth teller. They're telling the truth, and our mainstream media lies and lies and lies. And you guys know they lie. They've lied about all of these places with bombing all over the world. The mainstream media doesn't tell you. They lie and they lie and they lie. So they're lying about her too. Get into it. Look online. Free Chelsea Manning.